Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Ask the DM. I am your host, DM Bob Yo, and I don't know, left, depends on what direction you're looking.
My other
To
side.
my up to the side of me, next to me, is my wonderful, glorious co-host Tony. Tony, how's your week been?
Fine,
Good, good.
which is
Anything
better than normal.
right on? Okay,
I
fine is
mean,
better than
I'll
normal.
I accept par. That's a good week for me.
You know it is. It is, and you're a young feller. What they call one of
You
those
keep telling me
millennials.
that.
What they call one of those millennials, I think. So you may not quite realize it yet. Us Gen X folks, par is you're ahead of the game, I should say. Par is absolutely what we shoot for every week. Um, Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so let's get into it. Well, first, before we do, let me give a quick plug. If you haven't liked and subscribed and all of that sort of thing, please do so. Whether you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. A special plug for YouTube. Even if you don't normally watch on YouTube, if you could shoot over there and give us a subscribe, that'd be great because really I'm trying to get to the requisite for the vanity URL. So that would be amazing if you could make that happen. All right. So Scott, thank you for the like. Appreciate it. Good to see you as always. All right. So today we want to talk about a couple different things, but we're going to start with. Actually, I'm gonna throw Tony a little bit of a curve here. I told him we were going to start with railroading, and we will get to railroading. But I want to jump into one of the questions we got from one of our listeners, Kip. And he had a question about railroading, but there's one. I want to start with his third question. Uh, in your opinion, what class is overrated in D&D Fifth Edition? What class is overrated, and what class is underutilized?
Uh, well, I mean that certainly depends on the person. I think the overrated. I've heard people say that monks are broken, and I've heard people say that monks are the worst class, which is kind of crazy to me. That swings so heavy. I think a lot of classes, like the fighters, the barbarians, the martial classes are really powerful right out the gate. But then by the end, they don't really have much to do, and it's the wizards casting the wishes and all those full casters really sort of steal the show at the end, I think. So I think it depends on what level you're looking at. Um, if you want to just underutilized artificers, I guess, because they're new. Rangers, maybe because they had a recent revision or recent a year ago
Right, right,
or
right.
more.
Yeah, couple now, but yeah, no,
Yeah, a
they've
couple
they've, they've
years ago.
undergone changes. I agree with Rangers, and I think they get a lot of bad press. The Player's Handbook Ranger, everybody's, well, the Player's Handbook Ranger is underpowered, and maybe it is underpowered. Um, but I still love the concept, right? And even if mechanically it's maybe not as stellar as some of the others, I think it's underutilized because there's a lot of out of non-combat abilities that the ranger gets. Tracking is, for example, uh, just a terribly useful skill, and having a decent survival check, which yeah, I get that barbarians can do it and others can do it too, but
I
it,
mean, they can be just as stealthy as a rogue,
sure, yeah, exactly. Where a
but have
barbarian typically
spells.
not so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the casters versus melee. That's sort of always been one of the big things about D&D. Long before your time, in the ancient days when we played D&D with rules written on stone tablets, um, the wizard at first level had 1d4 hit points, and that's so there's typically two or three, sometimes one hit point. And the first level wizard, if you could survive to about third level, there was a good chance you're going to survive beyond that. But once you got Fireball, and those of you old school folks that are listening, you'll forgive me if I'm forgetting in my old age for sure whether it was 5th level or if it was a different point at which wizards got Fireball. Then you suddenly became overpowered. And, one of the ongoing discussions has always been a fighter versus a wizard in single combat. Who wins? Well, my answer traditionally has been if they come around the corner and bump into each other and get into a fight, the fighter wins, no contest. Give the wizard the evening to prepare, and they duel at noon tomorrow. Wizard wins every time. I don't know if that's still true, right? I think the 5th edition wizard, picking up from 4th edition especially, is much more robust, even in the early stages. So the question, I guess, remains then at 20th level, who wins, the fighter or the wizard? And I suppose it's whoever gets initiative, right? I mean,
my wizard would win.
Your wizard would win, whether or not he got initiative.
but yeah, like between high level casters, it's often like whoever has the first initiative, because you can get up a great concentration spell or just get one of those save or suck spells.
Mm-hmm.
And then it doesn't matter what they do.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, you make them irrelevant to the combat. And there's an interesting side discussion there about casters, right? And I talk about the wizard needing 24 hours prep time. Obviously, the sorcerer and the warlock don't need that as much, so it's somewhat contingent then on what spells the sorcerer and the warlock know. Whereas the wizard has the toolbox. I think the wizard is a little bit underutilized. I think the warlock is exciting enough, and the sorcerer, especially with meta magic, and sorcery points, is versatile enough that the wizard doesn't get as much love as he has in previous editions.
I think wizard is my favorite class.
Mine too. I mean, it's what I play.
Pretty sure, but like, it's the wizard artificer. If I could have a favorite multi-class, like that's it.
Yeah.
But Saturday was my first time playing a druid, and all that's left is paladin, and I will have played all of them.
All right, excellent. And Saturday you played we did a one shot for your birthday. You played a 20th level druid. How did you feel about that? What were your takeaways? Specifically from playing the druid, what were your takeaways?
I was a pit fiend most of the time, which was great. I leaned heavily into shape change, and I was talking with some people and about how, to a degree, shape change is almost as good as wish, because if you can just find a monster that can cast the spell that you want to cast,
sure,
then you just shapeshift into that monster and cast that spell. And the monster manual is expanding all the time.
Sure.
But I think it was a one shot and you really didn't care. Versus if it were a campaign, you'd be like, I don't know if you met a Rakshasa,
right,
and can plane shift out of there. I'm like, oh yeah, I totally did. And it's the same kind of thing with wizards. Some of those high level spells, the written in is it requires this costly component, which the DM can just say you didn't find it. Yeah. So it's really, like with everything, you have a conversation with your DM to like make sure what that your bubble's not going to burst.
Yeah, whatever you're building can actually do what you hope it can do. And that's a whole rabbit hole too. All right, well let's come back around. Let's come back around, and let's talk about plot, adventure design, and railroading. Now you brought the topic up in our prep for the session today. So tell me, what are your questions or thoughts or ideas?
Well, it's just something I was thinking about recently. I watch a lot of D&D videos on YouTube, and so periodically these things get recommended to me. And so, so maybe there's a sort of echo chamber zeitgeist of DM topics. But I've the first campaign I ran was I DM'd was Dragon of Icespire Peak, and I had a conversation with one of my players about whether or not it was a dungeon crawl because I didn't think of it as a dungeon crawl, largely because it's non-linear. So
Mm-hmm.
you can uh like Dungeon of the Mad Mage, you're going down, down, down. But I guess you can explore rooms within. And so the question is, how heavily am I railroading the players? What if they wanted to just um, go visit Neverwinter, uh, which is nearby
Right.
ish? Uh, I
Because
wouldn't,
one of the players read about it and said, "Oh, I want to go see that." Or there's this bad guy there that in character I have no idea exists, but how cool would it be to fight him, right?
or even you provide the on the player map that is provided to them. It says there's a big star and it says Neverwinter and it's the biggest city and you never go there.
Right, right.
uh, so I think the trope is where whatever you were going to have the players do, just put it on the road to Neverwinter. Uh, but I guess that's only really happens if you're running a module. Like the one of the first campaigns, the second campaign I ever played in was Descent into Avernus, and we played through the beginning three levels, which are bad, um,
Good to
bad
know.
and
Good to know.
irrelevant. Uh, and then it gets to a point where it's like, all right, do you guys want to go to hell? And as characters, we're like, no,
Not at all. I have
why?
no interest.
This is not our problem.
I'll get there soon enough on my own.
And, and so all of us were like, nah. And then the DM just sat there. It was like, guys, I guess we can play another adventure. But
Yeah,
you gotta go.
yeah, absolutely. So published adventures do tend to be a little bit more of a railroad. But you're also right about Dungeon of the Mad Mage to a degree because there certainly are options. Like I run a Dungeon of the Mad Mage campaign on Friday afternoons. Quick plug: we are ninth level, and I do have an opening for one player. So if you're interested in that, hit me up. $15, 2 hours, 4 to 6 on Fridays Eastern time. But so Dungeon of the Mad Mage, they've been through the first three levels. But from there, they've also gone up into Waterdeep, had some other adventures, and so they're a little high powered to just kind of go level by level. So one of the cool things about Dungeon of the Mad Mage, because it's a location based adventure rather than an event based or even linear railroad type adventure, are the portals where you can go down to deeper levels. Right, are dispersed throughout the dungeon. And so, they've been on the first three levels. They've been on 7. They've been on 9. They just jumped down into 11 and have no idea what they're getting into, but we'll see how it goes. So, in some ways, it's up to the DM to promote that flexibility if it exists, right? Dungeon of the Mad Mage, it does. A lot of published adventures, it doesn't. And you mentioned the first three levels of Descent into Avernus. Most of the campaigns, the published adventures, are that way. The first three levels are really an optional. You can run it. For example, if you run Princes of the Apocalypse, which you played in, and we finished off that campaign, I ran it from straight through. But you could run Dragons of Icespire Peak, or even more likely Lost Mines of Phandelver from the starter set. You could run Lost Mines and dovetail it into um, Princes of the Apocalypse. But yeah, I mean, one of the easy answers to the railroad is let the party do what they want, but make sure whatever you have planned shows up along the way. And there are times that's appropriate, and of course, that's probably one of the most frequently used tools. But I I think one of the things that D&D has done with varying degrees of success over the years is to teach dungeon masters how to design adventures. And if you look in the fifth edition DM's guide, it talks about location-based adventures. It talks about timed adventures where there are things going on, right? And those tend to be railroady. Um, but the it's not a railroad if you give the players enough incentive to do what they need to do. Now, sometimes they'll just say no. I ran a Forgotten Realms campaign with my good friends, my home group, many years ago, and they were in a town called Daggerford, and I had this whole sort of campaign mapped out, at least the first few levels, but it required them, adventuring from Daggerford, which is halfway down the Sword Coast between Waterdeep and Baldur's Gate. They wanted to go to Waterdeep. Like, we don't want to hang out in Daggerford anymore. Let's just go to Waterdeep. So as a DM, you have to make a choice, right? Do you do like your DM said with Descent to Avernus? Say, look, guys, I don't have anything planned for Waterdeep. The adventure, or in the case of running an adventure, the adventure doesn't go to Waterdeep. We can do something else, but if you want to play this adventure, you got to follow this line. That's certainly one way to handle it. I don't know if I'm fond of that. I mean, I guess when you get to a certain point, you have to, right? If the players are determined not to go to hell.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I guess it very much does become a different adventure. To a degree, it's on us, the players, because we knew the name of the campaign was Descent
Fair.
into Avernus.
Fair.
Now get down the hole.
Get down.
But
the only campaign where you can tell your players to go to hell and they're not mad about it.
But this begins to dovetail into the another topic of different kinds of players. But I don't mind when things sort of go off the rails. As a DM, I panic a little bit and I start taking notes, and I'm like, where do you want to go? Why?
Are you sure?
I'm like, okay, and I have a whole I have a notepad in front of me all the time, and I'm just taking notes, and then I figure it out later in Foundry. I'll make a map or whatever. I'm not talented enough as you to do it on the fly, but
it's not talent. It's curation. I've curated. No, I've curated with Patreon folks that I subscribe to and elsewhere. I've curated my collection, for example, of maps. I have hundreds, and I've named them appropriately. So if it's a cave I'm looking for, or a street, I can find those things pretty easily. That's all that is. It's not talent. That's just time.
But so as a DM, I'm totally fine with it. If the players want to do something crazy, just bear with me while I figure it out. And as a player, I want to do something crazy sometimes. Like people, and not just on a micro level, but on a macro level. Like we're, one of the campaigns I'm in, it's kind of at the end. We may be coming up on the last session, and so it's a very straightforward thing to go to the bad guy and bonk. But I'm like, we could really use some scrolls. Why don't we teleport to Candlekeep and buy some scrolls, and then we can plane shift back here, and then examine the teleportation circle and whatever, it'll take 2 minutes.
Sure,
Like,
exactly.
you just it'll be quick little errand. While you short rest, I'm gonna run across the world and grab some things.
Which is always the cool thing about high level that DMs are so rarely prepared for. You have this great, Frodo and Sam travel adventure sequence, all planned out, and the dude's like, "Hey, I'm just gonna plane shift us to the Feywild, and then I'll plane shift us back to Mordor."
Yeah, and
Um,
you know I'm up to that when I start asking questions like, have I seen the place before? Do I know anyone from that
yeah,
place?
right.
Do I have anything from that place? What do I know about that place?
At some
Like,
point,
I'm
travel
gonna get
sequences,
there.
yeah, you have to railroad. Here's a good example. All right, I just finished a 20th level campaign a week ago Sunday, and um, I needed I had some material that I wanted to use in a travel sequence. In They were in the first layer of the abyss, and well, why not? They needed to go to Aldenoc's Egg, which is a fortress the demon lord Aldenoch runs or owns and whatnot. Anyway, so the cool thing about the planes is that the powers that exist there, demon lords, deities, even demigods, have a say about planar travel within their domains. So, for example, Aldenoch can say, yeah, someone tries to plane shift in anywhere near Aldenoc's Egg, A, I'm notified about it, and B, I get to decide whether or not they come through, and if they do, whereabouts. And that's rules as written, right? In terms of planar travel, and a lot of DMs aren't aware of that. Now, when I say rules as written, we're talking about previous editions, but
Yeah, I'm like, not
um,
that I'm questioning you, but
no. There's not a ton of planar stuff out yet for fifth edition. There's some, and we're getting more, right? It looks like more planar and/or spelljammer type stuff is coming through. But
there are some spells like I was reading Gate, for example, specifically says, they can choose not to allow the gate,
mm-hmm.
and if they choose to come through, they can just leave or attack you or whatever. It says right in the spell, hey, don't expect this to work the way you want it to work.
Right. Well, and I let players know, right, when they're going to plane shift. I give them that disclaimer every time, just as a and technically, okay, fine, it's not canon in 5e, but yet, but it is canon in my games. So, but is that railroading, right? I mean, it's a Deus ex machina by definition, but I don't think a Deus is always railroading, right? Um, Especially if it's consistent across play. It's not just a one-time thing that those powers have the option whether or not to let you in, right? As long as you're consistent about it, I don't think it's railroading. I think it's set design.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
I mean, consistency is key.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
as soon as I hit, it was plane shift's the 7th level spell, so you take it at whatever. I don't
Yeah,
have these things memorized. 15.
sure.
Uh, uh, then as soon as I take it, then that's the time to have the conversation. Like, let's talk about tuning forks. Let's talk about what
Yeah.
planes are fair game. Uh, and just sort of get that out of the way. And for me, it's kind of a struggle because as a player, I want to do some surprises because I think they're fun, like not just for the players, but for the DM too. And I'm sure everyone loves my surprises and has just as much fun with them as I do. Uh, but
I for one enjoy them. I don't know about the other players, but I
yeah,
enjoy them. So that's
but
that's fine by me.
yeah, I mean, well, that's what makes you a great DM, Bob, that you're not annoyed at me. But but yeah,
I didn't say you didn't annoy me. I just said,
okay,
yeah.
good. Um, I have room for growth. Then,
Don't we all?
what was I saying? But
I'm not sure to come.
ultimately,
Yeah.
like it comes down to, like you were saying, consistency and just expectations at the
Hmm.
outset. And this comes up every time we talk about D&D, is you want to make sure that the the players and the DM have the same sort of expectations. Is if I had in my head that I know about the elemental planes, like especially if we've met a genie and I want to go see him again, I'd be like, hey, can you hook me up with one of those forks?
Yeah. No,
You should be able to do that.
and managing expectations, right? That's a skill that serves you well, not just as a DM or playing D&D, but in life, right? In marriage, right, or your interpersonal relationships of whatever sort. Managing expectations is huge. It's huge. On the railroading thing, I think. Let me ask you this: you're a relatively new DM, and I know for sure that you've run some published material. Have you designed adventures of your own? And to what extent? Single adventures? Have you designed a campaign? What's your experience been thus far?
Uh, Adventures, definitely not. I mean,
Oh, okay,
I'm still dipping my toe in designing one shots.
sure.
But what I have done is mixed together lots of different things. So we've talked about DM's Guild. I like DM's Guild a
Hmm.
lot. You can often find supplementary things. Um, so we were running Avernus, and I had to guest DM a couple sessions. And so I'm like, I need an Avernus one shot that we can sort of walk by.
Right.
Uh, and have you ever run Avernus or played Avernus?
I have not. I'm very familiar with it. I've read through it, and my former Monday night group is still going in it, and I like to follow along with their adventures. So
In my one shot, I kind of gave the party a little more than they could handle. I thought it was reasonable, but I even gave them an ally whom they almost killed. And I'm like, you will literally die if you kill this person. Please don't. Uh, but
sure, sure.
in my one shot, I took away the shield of the Hidden Lord because the choice was like that or they die. So the guy was like, well, give me that. And then the party just didn't go looking for it again. So that was like an artifact gone.
Hmm.
And uh my we were so bad at following side quests that we never even met Zariel. We never ran into Zariel
Ever, not
the
once.
whole
Oh,
adventure.
that's
No.
that's hilarious. If, at my Tuesday night game, do have one opening for that one. By the way, 9:30 p.m. to 1 a.m. Check local listings for time. Hit me up if you're interested in playing. Anyway, my Tuesday night game, and it's a custom. It's the shared world setting that I run in. A lot of my games in Obsidian Shards, and it's so the characters are members of the Harbor Ghosts. Uh, they're affiliated or run by basically a crime lord, and so they carry out various heists and that sort of thing. Or at least that's the idea. So among other things, they went. That setting has arena battles, are kind of a thing in the city of Kalanoir, and so they went into this arena battle, and they prepared ahead of time to bet on themselves to win, and which is now the players knew that that's a pretty standard thing because some of the players are in another campaign of mine set in Obsidian Shards, and they've done these arena battles, and so they didn't think much of it when somebody greeted them and said, "Hi, are you here for the to compete in the arena? And I'll take your bets." Okay, And so after the fight is over, after they win, the guy who runs the arena comes up and says, "Hey, good job, guys. Sorry I wasn't here when you first got here. You know, I hope I'm really impressed with your performance. Be glad to have you back." And they're like, "Well, what about your guy that takes the bets?" He's like, "Yeah, that's me." And so of course they got very angry, and so then they went to Boss Hamish, their patron basically, and said, "Hey, this guy stole our money that we wanted to bet." And Hamish was like, "Oh, I'll look into it. I'll see what I can do. You know, in the meantime, I have this mission for you all to go on." And so one of the players is like, "Hey, that really wasn't nice. Um, I didn't like that. We got robbed." I said, "Well, you know, first, yeah. I mean, this is a side of the city that you've never seen before in your other campaigns. But also, just because you couldn't find the guy, and just because Boss Hamish says he'll take care of it, doesn't mean you can't pursue it." So I think sometimes players feel like they're being railroaded, like I was railroading them away from getting their gold back, when really I was just placing obstacles, right? And making them determine what their priorities were. Well, do we want to go get this basically 500 gold that between the party they had bet? And that's a lot of money at third level. Second level, it might have been even at the time. Do we want to go? Do we want to continue to pursue that? And we have no leads? Or do we want to just do what we're told? And so that's a dilemma that the characters have to go through. But it felt to multiple players a bit railroady. Once I explained to them, look, you're dealing with a more seedy element of Cal Noir than you've ever dealt with. So that's as it's supposed to be, right? At least the theft part. Once I explain it, they're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. All right, we're going to find this guy and kill him. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. So.
Yeah, and to your point, you can take something away as long as like there's an opportunity to get it back. That my group could have gone after that shield and gotten it back. They just didn't.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be easy, right? You know, like I'm in the situation I'm describing. They might, for the shield, they might have to break into Zariel's castle or something. Who knows? All right, so adventure design then, where I'd asked about. So railroading has really comes a lot from how an adventure is designed. And the more a DM designs their own adventures, the more you learn how to create opportunities for the characters to do what they do without it being a railroad. And there's a world of difference. Or I mean, there's a it's a continuum, right? On the one side, you have the railroad, right? This is what the party has to do, otherwise nothing else makes sense. And way over here, you have a true sandbox campaign where the party has to go out and find things to do, right? Where there aren't necessarily adventure hooks being thrown at them. All that's being thrown at them is data. Here's what's happening around you. Here's who's in power. You know, somewhere in between those two extremes is where most DMs operate. And that dovetails into our next topic of discussion too, I think, very well. And you sort of hinted at it earlier, which is play style. Before we do, anything else that you want to, any other questions or ideas or thoughts you have about railroading, Tony, that you want to toss in? And of course, if you're watching at home, please make sure and give us comments and questions and whatnot inside the comments. Oh, by the way, Joe, Joe says, "Well played, Bob." He's talking about the Tuesday night group. Well played, Bob, but I still want our money back. I actually kind of like that move, to be honest. It didn't make me angry. It's opened up more role playing opportunities, in my opinion. Well, thank you, Joe. I appreciate the affirmation. Thank you. So yeah, any other railroading type responses, Tony?
No, I was just looking at my notes. I think we covered a lot besides the dovetail that we're going into, which is what happens when the players want to take different paths or different approaches. And the
Sure.
DM's like, whatever you guys want.
So D&D players, I mean, this has been talked about so long and so often. Sort of the player archetypes, and you even find it. I think the fifth edition DM's Guide maybe has a section on it. I could be wrong. It might have been one of the other more recent editions, but um, so often they're expressed in sometimes noble terms, but sometimes derogatory terms, right? Like you have the rules lawyer, and you have the min-maxer, right? Those are sort of the negative, some of the negative stereotypes. Uh, you have the newbie, which, depending on the group that you're playing with, may or may not be sort of a negative stereotype. You
The role
have
player.
what?
The role player.
Yes, the role player, the thespian,
Yeah.
the metagamer. That uses
The cheater.
all of the out of game knowledge. The cheater, right? That's not one we talk about much, but they do absolutely exist. The competitive player, right? So all these different play styles, which in my
And they can overlap. They certainly do
that's what I was
overlap.
going to say. In my 40 years experience, very rarely is anybody just one of these things. Um, I guess first talk to me. So you mentioned specific. Let's talk about some of what those archetypes are. You mentioned the role player. What do you understand to be the role player archetype?
So, first of all, D&D, this idea really doesn't exist in a lot of traditional games. There aren't like Monopoly archetypes, you know. So, so this was a new thing for me to grapple with because every game I've ever played has been, you know, like Gloomhaven, which is a game that I love. It's extremely strategic.
Yeah, you might have different
And
strategies,
yeah,
but not
and
necessarily play
we can
styles.
discuss those strategies, but nobody's sitting here like acting. Uh,
Acting.
Whereas just the idea that that's possible in this game, I think a lot of players walk into the game thinking like, well, that's what this game is all about. It's a role-playing game. Let's role play, which is fine. It's one of the archetypes. So I think a role player like really dives into their character backstory, character motivations, following the narrative. They love doing that. A campaign I'm in, my character is growing a little stale, and I want to swap it out. And uh, and then on top of that, we have a guest DM who's been guest DMing while the main DM is going through some life stuff, and so it's a little confusing about who's in charge, and and so I'm like, yeah. So just a retriever shows up, or what's the name of those guys from Mechanist, the big bad judgment guys? Uh,
Well, modrons of some sort, or
Yeah, what's the big modron that brings people to for judgment? I'm gonna get it in a second. It is a Marut. Yeah.
okay, yeah.
So I'm like, no, a retriever Marut comes up and says like you have to go to trial, and yeets my character right out of there, and then another character shows up. And then the guest DM was like, well, some people, frankly, including myself, would prefer a more narrative reason for your character to go.
Well, and I would split the role player into two types too. I would say you have the thespian who wants to use voices and mannerisms and wants to talk to every opponent, and really gets into the truly social side of it. And then I would also say that there's a connected but not identical archetype, the storyteller, right? And that one is concerned, like you mentioned, background and narrative ways of replacing a character and all that, and that sort of thing. They're very, very closely related, but I think they're not. They don't necessarily entirely overlap.
Yeah, definitely. So
Yeah. So with the role player, we have the storyteller. Now, in my experience, storytellers tend to become DMs, because they've got a narrative in mind, and as a DM, it's much easier to make the narrative happen than it is as a player. Having said that, many, many years ago, played in a Star Wars game. A good friend of mine decided to run Star Wars. This was the old West End D6 game, and he had a very specific story he wanted to tell. Us players wanted to go off planet as quickly as possible. And much like, I suppose, much like my players wanting to go to Waterdeep in the Daggerford campaign, I guess it's not that different. All right, so you have the role player, you have the storyteller. Let's
another archetype
Yeah.
which sometimes becomes a DM, which I consider myself, is like a tactician, where I really like diving into a complicated mechanical situation.
Mhm.
And so then as a DM, I'm like, let me throw something complicated at them. Like, let's see if they can
With lots of moving parts.
plane
And
shift their
yeah.
way out of this. So, one of the first one shots I ever did was this like tower with moving doors, where I had diagrams of different levels, and because it was Foundry, I even had like sound effects and switches so they could actually click on the door and the image would turn and then it would take them somewhere else. And this was one of the things I struggled with as a DM was, oh, I've prepared this maze for you, and then they just wanna act it out, and I'm like, yeah, but what about did you try going in the room?
that, that's an
some
option, going in the
some
room.
stuff's in there.
I, I,
So
I love the tactical stuff. There was a fourth edition adventure called Thunderspire Labyrinth, and there's a dungeon within this adventure known as the Well of Demons, and I have used this thing over and over and over again. I ran it at least 3 times straight through in fifth edition or in fourth edition when it came out. I ran it for probably 6 different groups in Pathfinder, when I had a group of guys that were into that, and I've run it, oh gosh, 4 or 5 times now in different fifth edition D&D campaigns, because there are all of these moving pieces, so they've got to place the MacGuffins. There are 4 of them. They've got to place them into the circles at exactly the magic circles at the same time, and they're not near each other. And there's this rolling doom sphere that's moving through the complex constantly. And there's a green dragon who's using a breathe, fly away till his breath recharges, come in and breathe on whoever's nearby tactic, right? So just beautiful tactical stuff. I love it. I love that one. I think the tactician, as when they're a player, is often overlaps with another kind of player, which is, we'll call him the optimizer. Detractors will say min maxers. Uh, so basically, in terms of your character build, you build the
it
characters.
literally means the same thing.
It does,
Min
but
max means like, I acknowledge that I have limited resources. I'm going to put the resources that I have toward the things that I want to do, and the things that I don't want to do,
well, it's
they are
it's
the
used in
dump
it's
stats.
usually used in a derogatory fashion. So I want to stay away from that because I
Yeah.
think there's value to optimizing. Do you consider yourself as a player? Do you, Tony, consider yourself an optimizer?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's one of my favorite things.
yeah, you
I
enjoy it.
even I like I play a lot of Civilization,
Hmm.
and I was trying to get into a friend into Civilization, and I made a huge mistake where we're doing like a multiplayer thing, and he has this warrior, and I'm like, and he's like, I'm gonna attack the barbarian camp, and I'm like, you should not attack that barbarian camp. And then he attacked the barbarian camp, and his warrior died, and then he's like, all right, well, what do I do now? And I'm like, build another warrior. And he's like, how long will that take? And I'm like, 32 turns. He's like, I have to sit here for 30. I told you not to attack the barbarian camp. And it turns into like at high levels of civilization, every square you move really matters. And you can like you need to think as you're exploring, there might be an enemy over there. I'm gonna move one square at a time and scout. And so in D&D, uh, yeah, I'm always thinking about that and thinking about ways out. uh,
Sure,
in life too, I want lifelines.
sure,
So all my characters always have backup things. So when I'm doing something risky, it's not that risky because I have something in my back pocket.
sure. The next one I will call, well, what we typically, the term that's usually used, and it's meant to be derogatory, is rules lawyer. But I I like better. I don't have a better term for it, but I don't think that one really fits. Someone who's mastered the rules and can quote chapter and verse, so to speak. Um, I don't know, maybe encyclopedic, uh, the rules encyclopedia. I mean, but someone that's mastered the details of how the game works, the nuts and bolts. And they get some flack because D&D, at least at one point, was, well, these are the rules, but they're just suggestions. The dungeon master can do whatever he wants. Which, we enjoyed it that way. Uh, but there were a lot, D&D was a lot more during those early days, a series of negotiations between players and DMs. It was more like the player saying, well, here's how I read it, and the DM saying, well, that might be the rule, but I don't like it. And the player has to convince the DM why. Um, I don't really like to play that way these days. If someone's into that, that's fine. But I think the rules exist to give a genuine framework. I mean, are there times where a particular rule can get in the way? Sure. But I think for the most part, the system now, anyway, at least with fifth edition, and I would argue, uh, yeah, rules is written, guy. Yeah, I would argue that with fourth edition too, it did it even a little bit better than fifth. But the system works mathematically. I
Yeah,
think it does for the most part, right? It's supposed to, anyway. It's designed to.
hopefully it does. The the thing with, I mean, beyond game balance, which I'm all about, like having designed games myself, um, it balance is important. And like oh, I don't like the way invisibility works. Well, this was play tested though. And if you start messing with this, you start messing with other class features that, but that aside, I'm definitely a rules lawyer. But in my opinion, the rules lawyering, it's almost like communication, right? We were talking about open communication. The rules are a shared language. It's a shared like book of understanding. These are these are the rules that we're all going to play by. So as long as we all agree to this, then miscommunication will be minimized because we can just say it whenever there's a conflict. Well, we return to this page and well, that's what it says. So I guess we'll do that. And then it sort of blunts the social blow of a disagreement because it's like, listen, I'm sorry, I would love to allow it, but you know
Yeah.
the rule says right there.
And again, nothing against folks that would rather play a game that's more flexibility in terms of the rules, but it might work for a role player or a storyteller, but for a tactician or an optimizer, it's not going to work as well, right? And that's not good or bad. I see it all the time. There's not a wrong way to play Dungeons and Dragons. I'll also say that not every group, not everybody, every person in every group can play well together. And that doesn't mean that they can't be friends in the real world or that there aren't other things going on. But not every game is for everybody. I've had players play in a couple sessions of my games and say, that was fun, but I'm looking for something else. And I'm okay with that, right? It's not an ego blow. I happen to know that there are lots of different play styles out there. All right, so
when COVID hit, and with a lot of my friends and I used to have lots of social touch points, like barbecues and whatever, and then COVID hit and everything was virtual, and the main virtual thing we did was D&D. And then over the course of years, this became our only social touch point. So then the lines started to blur a little bit until some of my friends reminded me, like, hey, you also know this person outside of the campaign. like let's do a movie night. Because we'll disagree a lot less. And so I think that's helpful too. In your games and start playing, it's often like complete strangers, and you don't have either the opportunity or the interest in getting together outside of D&D. But it's worth keeping that perspective in mind. I think that the way someone approaches the game isn't a summary of like
it's
the
not
way
their
they
whole
are
identity as a
person.
person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Joe asks, he says, as a DM, is there a combination of player types that you've experienced at your table that would either make a great session or just goes down in flames? We will answer that together momentarily. I want to cover one more archetype, and that is closely tied to the Rules as Written Guy, is the title that Joe's given us, or the Rules Encyclopedia, and that is the metagamer. The metagamer uses all of the available information to the person, to the player, to make their character decisions. So the rest of your party is 3 rooms away. Technically, your character has no idea what's going on, yet the player does. So the player makes decisions such that, based on all of that knowledge, or world knowledge. If you're playing, for example, in the Forgotten Realms, you know that Jarlaxle is a bit of a shady character, but that he can also be useful. And so you come into with this meta knowledge, and the metagaming used to be a fairly negative term, but I'll keep it now because you look, for example, at collectible card games, and Tony, I know you were a pro or near pro Yu-Gi-Oh player for a hot minute. In Magic the Gathering, we talk about the metagame. And in Magic the Gathering, usually it's different deck archetypes. And the last time I played competitively, anyway, it was always a rock, paper, scissors. There were basically 3 decks, and they were sort of a rock, paper, scissors configuration. And so metagame is just sort of understanding the big picture. Does it, some people don't like it because it breaks immersion. Some people like it for other reasons. Some people just do it by their nature. And I think for me as a DM, I don't necessarily encourage metagame knowledge. A lot of players are good at policing themselves, but what I do is when metagame knowledge does become used, I try to find an in-game explanation. So here's a good metagame situation. There's a puzzle. Right, you've got whether it's a word puzzle or whatever it is, you give the party a puzzle, and the barbarian who has an 8 wisdom figures it out immediately, and the cleric who has an 18 wisdom, for the life of him, can't figure it out because it's the players, right, looking at the puzzle, not the characters. So the way I sort of explain that in game, because it is metagaming, right? Whenever you throw a puzzle like that at your players, and they're not just rolling checks, it's metagaming. by definition, because it's player knowledge, not character knowledge. And so, but I explain it in game this way. Well, look, between the barbarian and the wizard, there's enough wisdom to solve this puzzle. Right? Even though technically it was the barbarian who figured out and not the wizard. Or a cleric, right? Or whichever. So there are some ways to explain those things in game.
Or what happens in combat all the time. Often combat gets slowed because it's like, what are you doing? Okay, I'll do this, but then you're gonna twin haste me, right?
I do try to limit, like the if it's not your turn, I make it. I say, make it brief, make your comments brief, and most players are pretty good about that. That avoids some of the more intense metagaming, but it's not uncommon to have a single player's turn, if there's a conversation going on, last, as opposed to the actual 6 seconds that a round is. Sometimes it'll last 4 or 5 minutes. But at some point, like my DM did last night in the game that I play in, he said, "Okay, yeah, that's definitely been more than 6 seconds. Moving on." All right. So
sometimes I can't help but metagame just because I know this monster. Like we were in Prince of the Apocalypse fighting, I think it was like a Hydra, and you're like, and he regains health, and I'm like, he took fire damage. Like I don't know that, but and that's like a little difficult for me, where it's like, I don't, this is your Hydra and your thing, but if you're, running it official, so that can be, but I try to be honest with certain things like that. Like if I'm attacking an enemy and I know that it's resistant or immune to necrotic damage,
sure.
I've asked you in the past, like, can I roll to see if I know this thing that Tony knows? And then if I don't know, then I'll do it as a test. But something that's worth mentioning is, we talked about balance and how the game is balanced. I don't think that the game is balanced around players not knowing the abilities of monsters. And I could be wrong about this, but if a monster is using something, or there's like a lair action going on that the players do not understand the mechanic of how it's working and they can't plan around that, that is a dramatically difficult thing. I mean, that really changes the encounter if they don't. I was in an encounter where just there were like 4 different kinds of darkness. And like one of the darkness was suppressing magic items, and then one of the darkness, like Devil's Sight could see through, and then another one was like super darkness that Devil's Sight can't see through. And it's like, can you just, I mean, the DM did great. This is not a knock on the DM.
No.
But like, as a player, I'm like, can I know, please, what is happening and when, so that I can work around it. And in that sense, metagaming almost becomes necessary. So how I like to handle it as a DM is, after a couple rounds, the first time it's used and it's a surprise, great. I didn't know that was going to happen. Of course, I couldn't plan around it. But after it gets used once or twice, I, as a DM, say, all right, you can put together that at initiative 20, like the
sure.
tide is going to rise.
Sure.
And I appreciate it as a player when that knowledge is shared with me, because it makes the combat more interesting and less random.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's like something as simple as resistance. One of the nice things about virtual tabletops, some of them anyway, is it'll show the damage that you do. You roll 18 hit points worth of damage, he only takes 9, because he's resistant to piercing or whatever, So those are beneficial, but absent a virtual tabletop, you're playing in person, whatever. As a DM, I try to remember, and even with a virtual tabletop, I try to remember to say, yes, he's got resistance. What I'll say is, I'll try and keep it in a sort of in-world, sort of keeping it with immersion, and say, doesn't look like it was as effective as you thought it should be. Well, that's just me saying he has resistance.
He was kind of smiling when you did that.
Yeah. I want to mention one more.
I often
Go
thought
ahead.
of, or not often, but I thought of this idea that I haven't implemented yet, but I could, of something like you're in the Shadowfell or something, and you don't know what your health is, and that alone would increase the difficulty tremendously.
Sure.
So I'm rolling all the damage for the characters, and I can even do this in the virtual tabletop where it's not showing you your health.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then it's like, all right, you're down. And then I'm not showing you death saving throws, and you're dead.
Yeah.
And so it creates this like real tension of, uh, like you describe the characters like you describe the enemies, like, oh, so and so is bloodied. And
Mm-hmm.
so now the cleric or the druid needs to, does he have time? Can I heal him?
Right.
But
Right.
I haven't actually implemented this, and I think if a DM does, you need to be really careful about how much that'll increase the difficulty. Just the not knowing the mechanics of the game is devastating.
Sure. Sure. So one archetype we didn't really talk about, and I don't know that's much an archetype as it is a behavior, is the cheater. I used to play with a good friend of mine. He was a very good friend. We did all sorts of things together. Our families were good friends. But I know that he was known among the group to cheat with his rolls, and 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 uh, and I actually observed it. Right, I actually saw it happen. Basically, if he rolled, it was quite elegant. If he rolled less than a 10, he would automatically add 10 to the number. So if he rolled a 5, it was a 15 that he would call out as his result. If it was um, if it was between if it was above 10, the answer was always 17 to 20. 1 second. Go on, buddy. He would always say the result was 17, 18, or 19. Not 20, he would only say if he actually got a crit. But so that happens. And, I tell my players, and obviously with a virtual tabletop, the dice are right there. But I tell my players, you can roll, if you want to roll physical dice, go ahead. All I ask is that you be honest. I have no way to check, and I don't care. Ultimately, I don't really look. If you are at the point in your life where what you need to do for personal fulfillment and happiness is cheat at Dungeons and Dragons, I'm not really going to be the one to stop you, or for that matter, judge you. I might feel a little bad for you. Obviously, if it's something that detracts from the game, then that's an issue. But that's always been my take. So the cheater. So all right, let's go to Joe's question.
If
Go ahead.
Just to respond to that, I think if I encountered someone cheating, I might think about why they're cheating, because I I don't I haven't cheated. Uh, but if I were to cheat, it might be because I'm scared. Like I'm scared of my character dying. I'm scared of like losing this item.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I cheat in video games all the time. Not
Sure,
in multiplayer
sure,
games, but
sure.
in single player games, uh, because I want to get ahead. But if I cheat too much, then it's not fun because I just have a button that says I win.
Right.
Uh, but if that's the reason, if they're cheating because they're scared or something like that, or they want to feel powerful or whatever the reason, then there's a conversation to be had there of like, hey, if your character dies, it's just a quest away from bringing them back to life.
Yeah.
Like they're we can work that out. Death isn't permanent. Like if you lose your magic item, like Harry's Nimbus 2000 broke, and then he got a firebolt the next book,
Right.
or the same book actually. So you don't need to be too scared, like holding on to that Nimbus 2000, because there's another broom that you might get a hold of.
And maybe a better one. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think if you talk to the cheater that way, it's a delicate conversation to have, but you say, hey, if you fail some rolls, it's going to be okay.
I'm not, I guess, at the point in my life where I'm equipped or have the desire, for the most part, to act as therapists to players. If they're good friends, that's a different story. And I'm not saying I wouldn't have the conversation, right? I'm not saying that, but again, I go in with the assumption I'm not mad about it, and I don't really care. But yes, you're right. There's probably something else underlying that could be addressed. I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, definitely assumed there's something underlying. I hadn't really thought about trying to address it, and I don't know if it'd be appropriate for me to do so in professional games either. Anyway, but
Yeah, I
yeah,
haven't professionally DM'd, so
yeah,
I've DM'd for friends and family where I would, even outside,
sure,
just with in the absence of a game, be comfortable with exploring
yeah,
what's bothering you.
yeah, exactly. No, that's a good point. All right, Joe's question. Let's get to it. As the DM, is there a combination of player types that you've experienced at your table that would either make it a great session or just goes down in flames? So I'll start by answering that one, and I'll start with the great session. And I think, in my experience, the best D&D sessions tend to have players that are not fully devoted to a single archetype, right? They've got characteristics from diverse archetypes, but also that they are a diverse enough group that some lean role player, someone else leans storyteller, someone else leans tactician, someone else leans, rules encyclopedia. I think that those different perspectives often make a really, really great experience. Um, would a monolithic, if you have a bunch of storytellers together, yeah, that could still be a good experience. But although storytellers tend to want to control a little bit, so too many storytellers, too many cooks, that sort of thing. Role players, maybe, but then they each want screen time, and if they're not getting it because everybody else is, they might be less satisfied. So certainly all tacticians, I think, can be a good thing if you're into that. And I think the Lair Assault program in fourth edition really made that a cool thing. Whereas the DM, you could literally just run the bad guys, and it was DM versus players, and they knew, and it was meant to be a tactical experience. So yeah, those are the ones I think can make for a good really is when there's a good mix or certain monolithic types. I don't know. What do you think, Tony?
Um, I mean, I've been in campaigns multiple where just sort of rub against someone who anybody watching, don't assume that this is your campaign because it's happened multiple times. But where someone might have like a disdain for the rules lawyery. One that's coming to mind is um, I was briefly in a campaign where there I was playing they rolled for stats and I
Yeah, yeah,
rolled really shitty.
yep.
And I was like, "Can I use point buy instead?" And the person's like, "No." And so I'm like, "Okay, well, I built a character that made super good use of the it was a monk that made super good use of the limited stats. So it was like a kobold who relied on advantage instead of a high stat, and could really dish out some damage. And I was like running past traps and stuff. So class features that don't rely on stats as much. I put a lot of thought into it. And then I also tried to role play. So we were in this battle and we were up against a barbarian. And as a low level monk, my attacks weren't doing as much against the barbarian. But then the warlock fired an eldritch blast, and I in character, I'm like, you can't resist that. And then the player goes, yeah, nothing resists force damage. And I can't help myself. I'm like, actually,
Actually.
there are I mean, they're rare, but like, let's never say never. Like, you could run into Helmed Horror or something
only a
that's
Sith
immune to force damage.
only a Sith deals in absolutes.
And the player really didn't like that.
Yeah.
Really didn't like that. Uh, and I thought I was actually being like kind of helpful because I prefer to know, when I'm building my character and looking at damage types, I know that fire damage is often resisted. But fire resistance is actually pretty valuable. But maybe you want to lean acid or necrotic or radiant because fewer thing like poison is dog shit. uh, sorry for making your stream PG-13 there,
No,
but
fuck you, Tony.
but so this is a bit of a tangent, but coming back to the group, um, it's like the best group that works together is a little patient,
Yeah.
with different things. So if I haven't rolled, I've been in campaigns where 2.5 hours went by and I haven't rolled a d20. I haven't rolled anything. And I am miserable. I don't even need combat. I just need to be using something. But I try to be patient and just acknowledge that like some people are really enjoying this. Uh, but it's always ideal if the role player doesn't want to be talking to themselves. I don't
Right.
think so.
Right.
And the tactician doesn't want to be waiting for combat. So
Yeah, and I think where it becomes a problem, to Joe's point, it's not so much specific combinations. I mean, some of a hardcore role player and a hardcore tactician sometimes will butt heads, but and have conflicting. Well, they're having conflicting expectations, right? We talk about managing expectations, but I think more often what causes a session to go down in flames or a group to go down in flames is well, you talk about a lack of patience and understanding, and where one or more players decides that the other play styles are completely invalid and a waste of their time. If you were to decide, for example, during that session that role player, or the folks involved in that 2.5 hours didn't even get to roll a die, not even a damn insight check because you weren't in the room or whatever. Uh, the if you were to decide, well, that means this group isn't for me, that'd be unfortunate. And sometimes you'd be right. You're right. I mean, in some circumstances, I think another situation that can make it go down in flames is when it's multiple folk of one archetype, um, and an individual of another, right? And so you have at a table five role players and one optimizer. And sometimes the optimizer is just going to feel out of place based on their play style. I don't think it has to. It doesn't. I don't think it means it can't work. And I think, again, the ones that work best are ones that sort of avoid the extremes, um, in terms of party composition. I go through phases, right? What am I as a D&D player? I go through phases, and I have. I mean, I've been playing the damn game for 40 years. Yeah, I've been everyone. I've been a role player, a storyteller, a tactician, optimizer, rules encyclopedia, metagamer. I haven't been a cheater. No, I haven't necessarily done that. I mean, that's again, I don't know if that's really an archetype as much as a behavior, but you know, I I've I've been all of them, and maybe because of that, I have an appreciation for every type. And you said something about, Bob, that's what makes you a good DM. I put up with your shit. No, it may also be because I've experienced the archetypes that you embody, and I've been them, right? Uh, I did a hot minute where I was really, really into the storyteller and role playing part. Matter of fact, my good friend Greg, and he will not let me forget this to this day, and it happened in the early 2000s, so it's been 20 years, give or take. We had a D&D session, and I decided that D&D is really, it's all about the cooperative storytelling, and nothing else is that important. And so during this particular D&D session, and it was myself, my wife, and a couple of friends, and Greg and his wife, and I decided that I felt the need to put everyone on the spot and become sort of joint narrators. So, for example, you come around the corner in the street. Tell me, Donna, what do you see? And or tell me, Kelly, what's in that barrel when you open the lid? Rather than me as the DM just telling. I decided we were telling stories together for whatever. Well, not everybody's into that, and especially, some folks are just by nature, um, have some, whether it's social anxiety or they're just quiet, or at the very least they don't like being noticed or put on the spot. And so when you do that to somebody, that's not cool. And Greg still to this day reminds me how his wife will not play Dungeons and Dragons because 20 years ago I did something stupid during a game. Um, can you learn those? Can you develop those skills and lessons without the experience? Yes, absolutely. But it requires a certain degree of empathy as a dungeon master. You have to be willing to say that rules lawyers are not a bad thing. Figure out as a DM how best to use them to make everyone to increase everyone's enjoyment of the game. Those min-maxers, they're optimizing their character because they appreciate the mechanical side of the game. Show some empathy to that. Let them do their thing, because what's going to make them happy is when they crit for more damage than anybody else in the party. The role player, do they sometimes go on ad infinitum, ad nauseum, and oh god, I just want to roll some dice even as the DM? Yeah, but show some empathy. That's what they're enjoying most. Let them enjoy it. It is a balancing act as a DM, balancing all of those play styles and desires. But it starts with empathy.
Yeah, exactly. So, I may find myself waiting for quote unquote something to happen, and I'm seeing a teammate talk to an evil guy and trying to convince the evil guy not to be evil. And I'm like, we're gonna fight him. Can I attack? But I don't. I don't attack I don't attack until, it's until the conversation's over. And uh on the flip side, what I've seen a lot is the role player who's, we're all here to have fun. We're just here to have fun. Why are you taking this so seriously? We're here to have fun. And I'm like, yeah, I'm having fun. Like I brought this character to the table, so it's fine until the role player gets upset that the optimizer's doing more damage or whatever
And
the
vice
case may
versa.
be.
Yeah, and vice versa. Like if the optimizers can't stop rolling his eyes because the role player is going on and on. Yeah, it's not just as DM, but you're right. As players, it requires a certain degree of patience, is something you mentioned earlier, and empathy.
And so I mentioned Yu-Gi-Oh to, I'd play some friends and, my siblings and wipe the floor with them. And I'm like, well, I could punch up your deck a little bit. You just tell me what kind of archetype you want to play. You want to play fairies? You want to have a fairy deck? I can make that work. I can make that work pretty well. And I always offer that to people too. I'm like, you want me to punch up your character? It's like, well, if you took your first level in fighter, you'd get the con save proficiency, which is as opposed to taking your first level in rogue or whatever. So the con save proficiency is super helpful for spell, and so I'll do that sort of thing. And so if you're going to be upset that your character isn't optimized and you don't want to optimize, the optimizer would love to help you out with that. Like when I DM, and I DM for a lot of new players who just want, they don't know how to build a character. I say, well, describe your character, describe the character, and then I'll build something that really fits that character. And then some of my experienced players are like, why is their character so powerful? And
The,
I'm like,
you know,
it just,
there are folks that would most definitely prefer not to optimize. Like an intentional decision, and so it was not. I don't think our group on Thursday. Maybe it was. Uh, Someone was offering some optimization advice, and the other player said, "I'm not interested." And that's fine too. And again, that's about empathy. That's what the optimizer understanding that not everybody's into it. I, in that vein, I'm comforted by the fact that we talk about mathematically about how the system works. So, a difference between an optimized and a non-optimized character in D&D 5th edition, depending on level, can get up to probably about a 70 to 100% difference in terms of power level. So basically, the optimized character can be as much as twice as powerful as the non-optimized character. In 3rd edition and Pathfinder 1st edition, I haven't played any of 2nd edition Pathfinder, but uh, in Pathfinder 1st edition and 3rd edition D&D, the difference was more like 300 to 400%, which is just crazy. Which made it very difficult, and that was one of the other questions that we had asked, that Kip asked on the Discord. Was how encounters and things with different power levels. So maybe we'll dovetail into that in a minute. Um, I've said it before. Anybody who's talked to me about D&D for more than 10 minutes will probably could tell you that how much love I have for 4th edition. In 4th edition, the powerful, whatever good and bad you want to say about it, the power differential between optimized and non-optimized was more like 30 or 40%, which as a DM is much more manageable, right? So there's that. But even in 5th edition, it makes it a little bit challenging for a DM. And that's the question. Let me see how did he phrase that? Kip says, "How do you challenge overpowered characters within the group?"
optimizing characters is one thing. Optimizing tactics is another thing.
That's true
That
too.
some players are receptive to that. Like my brother Casey didn't care.
Yeah,
And so I was basically telling him what to do, and then once I told him what to do, he's like, "This is awesome."
yeah.
I'm like a walking
Oh yeah.
healing tank.
No, his character was awesome on Saturday.
Uh, but other people really don't like being told what to do, but then they also don't like their characters dying. Uh,
That's something they have to figure out individually, right? There's only
yeah.
so much that as a DM or fellow players we can do to encourage that, I guess. Uh, but so how do you balance different? How do you challenge the way Kip words it is? How do you challenge OP characters within the group? And I'm going to answer a different question. All right, just a slightly different question. And I'm going to say, how do you make sure that every character in the group is feeling useful during combat? And that's I think the objective, right? Um, Everybody wants to be engaged and useful during really most of all of D&D, all of whether it's combat, exploration, or role play. Um,
It's just as bad when the barbarian is not in combat
Yeah.
and just feels completely useless.
I've some barbarians that have had really excellent role play experiences. Maybe not so much their mechanic. Oh well, intimidation, and we've talked before about using, for example, strength-based intimidation. But how do you handle it with it? So there's a couple ways, a couple of approaches. One is when you're designing an encounter, you intentionally include challenge ratings that will challenge the specific characters at their specific power level. That can be a sticky wicket because the non-optimized character goes after the mob that you designed for the optimized character. Well, they're going to get killed. So, as a DM, a lot of times you have to you have to sort of negotiate that thing. You sure you want to go after him? He looks like he's I don't know, spell resistant or whatever it is. Um, and then you encourage the optimized character to go after him. That can be one way. Something else I like is to make sure there are different things to do during an encounter apart from just fighting. Um, whether that's basically a side skill challenge that's going on, and those can be harder to incorporate. And if you do it every time, it gets old for the players real quick. So don't necessarily do it every time, but for example, there's a ritual being cast, and you have to every round somebody's got to make a successful Arcana check in order to keep the ritual from being completed, or whatever the case may be. Give other tasks, or there's also you're fighting against overwhelming odds, but you're really just here to get the MacGuffin in the safe, so the rogue can be off there opening the safe while everybody else is in combat. But it can be a bit of a struggle. Again, not as bad in 5th edition because of the power differentials. I don't know, have you DM'd, Tony, with characters of different power levels, and how do you handle that?
Well, the cheap, horrible way to do it is to like create an encounter that plays to the overpowered character's weaknesses,
Yep.
which is cheap and will make them feel shitty and will make really nobody happy. Uh, a more,
Well,
yeah,
let
so
me give a
like
footnote. You can do it occasionally, but if you
occasionally,
do
yeah,
it for every combat, yeah, they'll be very unhappy. I mean, they'll be unhappy if you do it once, but you know,
yeah. So like I ran a one shot and the the player kind of knew I added fire resistance to this enemy. And like, I'm sorry. but I felt like it wasn't necessary. Uh, I know it was only the once, but um, what may be a more nuanced, clever way to do the same thing is to make an enemy that has an ability that um, the optimized character can really help with.
yeah,
Uh, so if you have an optimized martial class, like an optimized fighter, and then there's an enemy who uses like a like a a beholder or something with an anti-magic cone, then the optimized fighter is like, oh boy, like I can help with this, or uh, or same thing with maybe an optimized spellcaster is up against another high level spellcaster, and all of a sudden those counter spells are super important. And now the optimized character is has to do a lot of resource management with like, when am I going to counterspell? When am I going to use my reaction? What level am I going to counterspell at? And this can be sort of fun and challenging for the optimized character. And I think that's a much better way of going about it. It's more work for the DM, but whatever, suck it up.
I don't know that you can do it for every encounter, especially like if you're running a published adventure, right? I mean, at some point, uh, if I'm running, Princes of the Apocalypse or whatever, I'm part of the allure of running a published adventure is not
You
having
don't
to
have to.
customize encounters.
A way of doing that then is it's entirely reasonable for the enemies to identify that this character is super powerful, and maybe I want to go after that wizard in the back that's being such a pain in my run, instead of just, what am I going to do, wail on this paladin that's in front of my face? That doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do. So depending on the enemies, you can change your tactics, and it's not so bad if you can think of a narrative reason why they would. So if, a couple oozes are oozing around to get to the spellcaster, come on. But if it's a lich or a mind flayer, it's reasonable for them to skirt around that fighter.
Let's zero in on that for the remainder of our discussion today. Let's talk about tactics, and specifically monster or NPC in the broad sense of the term tactics. Um, I I run these days. I tend to take the approach that every creature, regardless of its intelligence and wisdom, with rare exception, is going to behave tactically. Now, um, you mentioned specifically like the ooze working his way back to the wizard. In a situation that's that glaringly obvious, I might I might demur a bit. But for the most part, even the not terribly wise or intelligent goblins might decide to go after the wizard, right? Because magic bad. Like you say, you can find a way to explain it in game, but really, look, as a DM, you, as a DM, any given encounter, you're typically anyway going to run it once. If you're like fortunate like me and you get to run lots and lots of games, and so you reuse material or I, for example, I'm in my just started Sunday my sixth Waterdeep Dragon Heist game. Those are the exceptions, right? But for the most part, when you run an encounter, you're going to run it once. The fact is, your players have been playing those characters every session, every week, for however long you've been playing. They've had all of that time to figure out how their characters work, what they do best, and on top of that, it's the only real responsibility they have is management of their own character. As a DM, for a given session, you're preparing usually multiple encounters, right? And so, yeah, and maybe you've run the creatures before, maybe not, but you, on average, as a DM, unless it's a creature that you use a lot, players will get tired of it. You haven't had the experience or time to optimize that NPC's strategies, right? Even if you include strategizing as part of your prep, it's still very limited compared to what your players have. So as a DM, you need that advantage, I feel like.
Yes. Um, One thing I would add, though, in terms of the DM being tactical, is the DM has complete knowledge, and the players don't. And that's to say, the DM knows every ability of the players, and furthermore, what they're probably going to do because has the benefit of seeing what they've done in the past. So there was, for example, if you have a DM spellcaster versus a player spellcaster, and there's a sort of contest of counter spells. Like, as the DM, like, I'd encourage you to stay a little honest with like what level you're casting the counter spell at, as opposed to knowing the level that the player's casting it at and then upping it by one. Uh, try to simulate
Yeah, that's a little
the
far.
the NPC not having that exact knowledge.
I've gotten
So it
in the
yeah,
habit as a go ahead.
like you will say the NPC is casting a spell. Well, if you're gonna do that, then when the player casts a spell, pretend the NPC doesn't know what spell it is,
I,
as opposed to, no, oh, I better counterspell the disintegrate.
as a player, I've gotten in the habit of saying, I cast a spell, and waiting for giving the DM plenty of time to counterspell before I say what it is. I think that is yes, as a DM, if the player gets excited and say, "Okay, I cast fireball," you have a responsibility as the DM to not know what the spell is or to act as if you don't know what it is. But also, I think what players can do to help that is to say, "I cast a spell." Give the DM a moment to respond. Uh,
Just the other day, I, as a player, said I counterspell that at level 4,
yeah,
and I did that for a reason, which was that I had some spells that uh at the third level spell slot I could take advantage of, and the fourth level spell slot I really didn't have a lot of uses for. So
right.
I'm like, this is a great opportunity to up that counter spell. And then, oh, I got counterspelled at a higher level. Okay.
Uh, Along these lines, Kip asks, and hi Kip, glad to have you on the stream. When playing NPC enemies in combat, how do you determine what player gets targeted? Is there a standard order, or do you have a random? And then parenthetically, other than any mounted characters, as we know, Bob targets them first. Always. I do have a bit of a reputation with mounts. Because okay, yes, I'll admit readily I have a chip on my shoulder about mounts because let's face it, uh, you ride your horse into combat, he's never going to survive unless you've got special character design abilities that you've invested in to give your mount more capability. That warhorse is not going to survive that first dragon's breath weapon. He's just not. And if you're on a mount, sometimes it's because you're really good at doing things mounted, and the enemies are smart enough to figure that out. Right? I mean, the cavalry is always a better target than the infantry. So that's my self-defense there. But how do you determine what character gets target? Is there a standard order? You have a random. How about you, Tony? How do you decide who the NPCs target?
It's a combination of who's aggressing them, who's the most dangerous to them, slash who's in front of them. Maybe with a sprinkle of like who, maybe I'm gonna target the overpowered character. But what I've found myself doing, and this is a little mean, but I just sort of think it's fair, is if the players are gonna focus fire, I'm gonna focus fire, and there's no reason that the dragon wouldn't bite your head off. And then sometimes I even go a little extra, and like he has killed the character and he claws again. like, like
I
just in a rampage. So I'll find myself doing that, and then just sort of force my players to work around that. Like, know that this enemy is going to be totally brutal, and don't count on being able to go up there and not get attacked.
I think you can do that to a limited degree, but if you attack unconscious players with any regularity, you're going to find you're probably at an empty table. Um, I don't
I
think you can do it
mean,
every
dude,
combat, right?
not at low levels. I
No,
personally think
fair.
that low
True.
level characters, I think everyone should survive until level 3, at least. I don't want any characters dying at level 3 or lower.
Very
Because
different
I
than
think
AD&D, yeah.
I think that's a bummer.
Yeah.
But you're level 5, you have access to revivify.
All
Someone
bets
can
are
die.
off. All bets are off.
Someone can die.
All right.
I know you have those diamonds.
No, that's fair. That's fair.
Maybe the cleric, we as a in one of my games as a party make sure that like, all right, the cleric knows revivify, the druid is good, but also the paladin has a ring of spell storing that has revivify in it. Like
Right.
like spreading out the heals a little bit to make sure, my wizard has gentle repose and teleport.
For me, it depends very much on the nature of the combat, who is aggressing. If someone hasn't attacked and showed hesitation in attacking, they probably won't get attacked right away. But once a caster has cast a concentration spell, all bets are off. That is the target. And yes, that is to some degree metagame. But I'm playing the game at that point, right? It's a game designed to be played. Um, More often than not. The other thing you mentioned, focus fire. I will absolutely focus fire, and it's funny. It's interesting because different parties, different tables seem to have different approach to combat. Some are like, all right, let's damage all of them a little bit, and until we can take them all out. Whereas others are like, okay, start with that guy and that guy. Those are our two main targets to start with. Ignore everybody else. I see most groups it feels more random about who they're attacking. They're like, I'm gonna attack whoever's closest, right? And there's no real conversation like, get the big one, until you're well into combat, at which point the big one has already started to do some of its tricks. And then they're like, oh, maybe we should go after that one, you know. Um, I don't know, as a player, how do your players, or you personally, or your players, how do they tend to approach mobs? Do they tend to focus fire?
Uh, Usually, in my experience, it's usually me saying maybe we want to do. So, like, we were in a combat and a warlock showed up, and I'm like, okay, we got dinosaurs, but we also got this spellcaster.
Right.
Like, let's kill that spellcaster, or at least was my priority, and then I was much safer. So like, uh, but often there's some communication between players saying like, like a campaign I was in the other day, one of the players got caught in a maze, which is a super annoying spell because there's no
Yes.
save. And
Yes.
so I'm like, I can either heal myself or beat up this guy and try to get you out. Uh, but if I beat up this guy and try to get you out, I'm going to be very vulnerable. So please heal me once I get you out. That would be swell. And if there's not that coordination, then I mean the encounter is lost.
I think.
And then to the point of the focus fire, I think, yeah, the dragon or the manticore is gonna try to kill you and eat you, but the drow slavers, it's entirely reasonable that they don't want to kill you because you'd make a pretty good slave.
Right.
So even if you are killing them, that's just more reason that they want to capture you and use you.
Absolutely. I think in terms of like party composition, one of the things that's extremely useful, but I see very don't see that much of, is a dedicated. Um, I'm not going to say healer because there's more to it than that. So character archetypes, have always been fighter, wizard, cleric, rogue, or sometimes we borrow terms from the MMO world, and they get their
Like
terms
the
from us both.
tank blaster
Yeah, tank blaster.
healer.
So the categories that they used in a previous edition of D&D were defender, controller, striker, and leader. Right? Defender, high hit points, high armor, soaks up damage. Striker does a lot of damage. Controller moves pieces around the battlefield. and then leader. So I find very few dedicated leaders. Leaders do healing, they do buffs, um, which are sort of borderline control depending on the edition of the game that you're playing. And the groups that I've found to be the most resilient, though, are the ones that have a dedicated leader who can both buff and heal, and is perfectly content doing that. Has no desire, they can deal some damage if they need to, but that's not what they're about, son. Um, it's, and I like those role definitions, right? I like those role definitions a lot. I like to play controller wizards. I want to move the pieces around the battlefield. I want to shape who can get where, when, and how. I want to make that bad guy irrelevant for the next 10 rounds. I don't give a rat's ass about AoE. So literally last night in my game, I took flack, in the game that I play in on Monday nights, I took flack from another player, probably rightly so, because we had a situation where a fireball would have been extremely useful. I'm a 6th level wizard, and I don't have fireball in my spellbook. I refuse. It's if you ask Laushan, my character, you ask him, I said, well, fireball is terribly inelegant and not nearly as precise and worthy of a caster's energy. I'll leave that for the sorcerers and the warlocks and the lesser casters.
Yeah, my wizard doesn't have fireball or lightning bolt prepared either, and in fact has very little AoE at all. But I like playing melee wizards.
Oh,
Um,
okay, all right.
like and when I played Dragon Age, I was all about like the arcane armor. Uh, and so, I have my wizard who the sorcerer did a haste on the wizard. Another wizard did a fly on my wizard. The cleric did a bless on my wizard, and I did Tensor's transformation on myself. And I went up there and I was doing 166 damage a turn.
So
It's
you're
just like
you're a striker, not a controller, though.
wailing on them with a great sword with my 7 intelligence or 7 strength.
Then
But
you're playing a striker. You're no longer playing a controller.
yeah, and
I
so yeah, another player was like, as the wizard. I'm like, the wizard? And he's like, the squishy wizard. Like, as the squishy wizard, not my 27 AC, a great sword,
right,
like
right.
battlesmith war mage.
Maybe it's the trauma. Maybe it's the trauma of having to start to roll wizard after wizard after wizard at first level in advanced Dungeons and Dragons until one finally survived long enough to not be killed every session. But I can't bring myself to play a wizard that gets up into melee. I will occasionally, venture toward the front of the combat, but only if I know that either this round or next round I can misty step back the hell where I belong. There is not a circumstance in which my wizard is going to intentionally be on the front line. So mad props to you for doing that. I guess it's because you don't have that trauma niggling at you.
I think Sasasas, the character I play in your campaign, is the first character I've ever played that's ranged.
Yeah, really.
Uh, like every other character, including spellcasters, I've always been, uh, a melee character. But
Interesting.
I do still enjoy the utility and the buffs. So like that character in particular is ranged, but also control.
Yeah.
So like hold person, blast, blast, blast.
Yeah, and
Suggestion, go away.
there are archetypes that are compatible, right? Striker and controller can be made to work together. Defender. So Defender is an archetype that it really kind of gets lost and really only existed in its best form in one of the previous editions. Defender doesn't necessarily deal out a ton of damage. They just take the hits. They become the, and they things like marking where, you have to attack me or you got disadvantage on everybody else. That sort of thing.
Yeah, like my armorer, artificer, or Darius's ancestral barbarian. It's like if it's not me, good luck.
But he's also, as a barbarian, he's also a striker for sure. He's going to deal out damage, very likely.
Yeah. But it's drawing aggro.
Yeah.
And that character had the most HP I've ever seen. And it was at 365 at one point.
My Wednesday group, Joe, if you're still listening, I don't know if you are, but Joe's character has a sword as an artifact weapon, Black Razor. And among other things, when you kill a creature with Black Razor, it absorbs its life energy and gives you temp hit points. They expire after 24 hours. Or maybe it's next long rest, I forget. Anyway, it gives you 10 hit points equal to the creature's max. So he had a killing blow on creature with 300 plus hit points. And they're 16th level, right? So in addition to his 200 some hit points that he has out of the gate, he had 300 temp hit points for a while. So that was fun. That was fun. Although that character, Jorik, is sort of more the classic defender because he doesn't deal out a ton of damage. He does get up there and he hits with his sword, but it's not like he's got a Ascendant Dragon's Wrath weapon or even like a flaming longsword or whatever. This sword just sort of typically just does, regular damage essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, like with everything, there's overlap in that too. My wizard also happens to be a tank with, HP second only to the paladin, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we're just about to our close date. I want to say first of all, thank you to everybody who's watching. Special thanks to those who commented. Remember to like, subscribe, and all that. And I want to give a quick plug. Thursdays. We'll be back this Thursday. We've been on hiatus for a minute. We have some personnel changes, but Thursday evenings, 7:30, right here on Twitch, YouTube, or Facebook, wherever you're watching, is Rise of the Drow. It's one of my campaigns. Tony plays in that game. Very exciting game. We do have a couple of open spots, and I want to throw this out for listeners, whether you're watching this live or after the fact. If you happen to hear this podcast, stream / whatever the hell today's show, and you are interested in joining that campaign, hit me up. I'll give you 2 weeks free. Come join us for a while. We are, what level are we at in Rise of the Drow, Tony? Like 9th, 8th, 7th?
It is, I feel like we should be.
All right, we're 13. We're 13, DM Bobbio.
We're still 7, but I feel like we're on the cusp of 8.
You are on the cusp of 8. So, yeah, sign up for that game. Again, hit me up, or there are links on most of the sites to go to startplaying.games to sign up for that one. I have some other openings so make sure to check out my profile on startplaying.games. Like, share with all your friends. Tell them how happy you are to be here. Welcome to the other new viewers. I notice a lot of names that I've not seen watching us before today, so welcome, welcome, welcome. We're glad that you joined us. Send me, in the meantime, feel free to send me your questions for next week. Bob at DM Bobbio, or via Facebook message, or whatever messaging system you prefer. You can send those to me, and we'll see everybody Thursday night, and then again next week. Yeah,
I want to add to your plug that campaign happens to be a campaign that goes to level 20,
yes.
Which I think is a very attractive prospect, and it's a high magic campaign, which I enjoy. So a lot of flexibility, a lot of options. There's going to be a lot of I think there's going to be a lot of exciting variety in that game.
A lot of player options too, because we are using the Adventure a Week AAW games. We are using their supplemental materials for the Underdark. We have one player whose character is a Drider, for example. So all sorts of fun, non-standard D&D options. It's the only campaign that I run currently where I have anything that is not WotC Wizards of the Coast official allowed. So
Yeah,
if
you can be a little bone mariachi guy.
yeah, what's a bone mariachi guy? I don't even know if I saw that.
It's one of those Underdark races. I can't even keep track of them all. There's a lot. There's really a lot of options,
And
and
I'm not running
and
it straight. I've incorporated a good bit from previous editions. For example, Drow of the Underdark from second edition by Ed Greenwood, as well as the Mensa Bronzen box set, and even the fourth edition Underdark book. I've got, oh yeah, here it is, Drider of the Under. I've got all that stuff here. So
and
yeah.
I'd be happy to. I mean, whether or not they join that campaign, I'd be happy to help people with characters. And then even if they don't want that help, I'm pretty good at setting up custom stuff on D&D Beyond and even Fantasy Grounds. So just to make your experience a little easier, you have to do less manual work. I can help with that stuff.
Thank you for that, Tony. I really appreciate that. Really appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, everybody, have a great week. We will see you next time.